Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The sky over Camelot darkened unnaturally, a swirl of ominous clouds twisting above the great castle as if nature itself sensed the disturbance. Deep in the heart of the castle, in Merlin's chambers, the old wizard's eyes burned with the kind of focus that could only come from treading dangerous waters. His hands moved in quick, precise motions, tracing sigils in the air that shimmered briefly before disappearing. In front of him, the rift, a jagged tear in the fabric of reality, hovered like a wound in space, crackling with energy. "Careful, Merlin," Arthur warned, standing at the doorway with his arms crossed, his brow furrowed in concern. His voice was steady, but it carried a tone of unease. Merlin gritted his teeth, his fingers trembling as the final sigil lit up with an airy glow. "I know what I'm doing, Arthur," he muttered, though deep down he wasn't so sure. This spell, this experiment, it was beyond anything he had attempted before. He was playing with time itself, and the consequences should anything go wrong were unimaginable. Arthur took a step forward, his gaze flickering between Merlin and the rift. "You've never been reckless, Merlin." "Until now." The wizard's sharp eyes met Arthur's, and for a moment, Merlin considered stopping. But it was too late. The spell had already been cast, the wheels already turning. "I have no choice," Merlin replied. "We need to see what lies beyond." As soon as the words left his mouth, the rift pulsed violently, the jagged edges flaring bright. A deafening crack split the air, and before Arthur could react, the rift expanded. The world around them shifted. The walls of the chamber stretched, distorted, and suddenly, everything was wrong. Arthur stumbled, his vision swimming as the room melted into a twisted version of itself. It was Camelot, but it wasn't. The flags that once bore his sigil were torn, the walls crumbled, and outside, the once proud city was engulfed in chaos. The people, his people, were rioting in the streets. Famine, war, plague, yeah, everything was wrong. Arthur turned to Merlin, his heart racing. "What have you done?" But Merlin was staring at the rift, his face pale. Through it, a vision appeared, a Camelot where Arthur never ruled, where his throne sat empty, and Morgana, his half-sister, wore the crown. Merlin whispered, his voice barely audible, "This isn't right, this isn't how it's supposed to be." Arthur felt a chill crawl up his spine. "That's Morgana," broken bar. His voice trembled as the realization struck him. This was a future where he had failed, where his leadership had never come to pass. "Merlin, close it." "I can't," Merlin said, his voice laced with dread. "It's too late." The rift crackled again, and this time, the vision expanded, drawing them both into its depths. Time blurred, and Arthur felt the world warp around him as if he were being pulled through centuries in mere seconds. When the whirlwind of time finally spat them out, they found themselves in a battlefield. Camelot's banners were nowhere to be seen, but soldiers wearing Morgana's crest filled the horizon, their dark armor gleaming under a blood-red sky. The city was a ruin, its once glorious towers crumbling into dust. Arthur gripped his sword, Excalibur, tightly, his knuckles white. "This is wrong. All of this is wrong." Merlin stood beside him, his face shadowed by regret. "The rift has thrown us into a future that should never exist," he said. "A timeline where Morgana has won. We need to fix this, Arthur. We need to repair the rift and set things right." "How?" Arthur's voice was steady, but his mind raced with questions. "How do we undo this?" "By finding the moment it all went wrong," Merlin replied. His eyes narrowed, focused on the distance where Morgana's dark fortress stood, dominating the skyline. "And by stopping her before she changes everything." Arthur's heart pounded as the weight of the task set in. Time itself had been torn apart, and he alongside Merlina was now tasked with mending it. But the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. If they failed, Camelot and the Futuria would be lost forever. As they moved through the battlefield, the stench of death and destruction filled the air. Arthur's heart clenched at the sight of his once proud knights lying lifeless in the dirt, their armor broken, their swords shattered, This was the world without him, the world where Morgana ruled unchecked. "I don't understand," Arthur said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "How could this happen? How could she do this?" Merlin's jaw tightened. "The rift showed her what could be," he said, "and she used that knowledge to manipulate the past, to twist the future to her will. This is a world where you never rose to power, Arthur, where you were cut down before you had the chance to lead." Arthur's eyes burned with fury. "We need to stop her." "Yes," Merlin agreed, his voice low and resolute. "But first, we need to find her, and time is not on our side." They pressed forward, moving cautiously through the war-torn landscape. Every step felt like a descent deeper into a nightmare. The air was thick with tension, and Arthur's every instinct told him they were being watched. Suddenly, a sharp, feminine voice cut through the silence. "You shouldn't have come, Merlin." Arthur spun around, his sword raised defensively, but it was Merlin who stepped forward, his eyes locking onto the source of the voice. Morgana stood before them, her dark robes fluttering in the wind, her piercing eyes alight with a malevolent gleam. "You think you can stop me?" she sneered, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "You're too late." Arthur felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "This isn't your future, Morgana," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "You can't rewrite history to suit your desires." Morgana laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "Can't I? You see the world before you, Arthur. This is my future, my victory. You were never meant to sit on the throne. Camelot belongs to me." Merlin's eyes narrowed. "You're tampering with forces you don't understand, Morgana." The rift is my tool," she interrupted, her voice sharp, "and with it, I will control not only Camelot but all of time itself." Arthur's grip on his sword tightened. He couldn't let this stand. He wouldn't. "We won't let you win." Morgana's smile faded, replaced by a look of icy determination. "You're too late, Arthur," she hissed. "Time is on my side now." With a flick of her wrist, a powerful wave of magic surged toward them. Arthur raised his sword just in time to deflect it, but the force of the blast sent him staggering back. Merlin raised his hand, summoning a shield of light to protect them, but the energy crackled ominously, threatening to break. "Morgana!" Merlin shouted, his voice filled with both anger and sorrow. "You don't understand the consequences of what you're doing." "The time linear." "I understand perfectly," Morgana snarled, "and I will see this through, no matter the cost." Arthur struggled to his feet, determination burning in his chest. He wouldn't let her win. "Not like this." "Merlin," he called out, his voice steady, "we need to close the rift." Merlin nodded, his expression grim. "But we'll need to get past her first." The ground beneath them shook as Morgana's magic intensified. Arthur's heart raced as he realized the battle for Camelot and for time itself had only just begun. Arthur steadied himself, gripping Excalibur with both hands as the magic surged around him. The ground quaked beneath their feet, and the air crackled with energy from the rift. Morgana stood before them, her eyes burning with dark power, her magic twisting the very fabric of reality. There was no time to think, no time to plan. They had to act now, or all would be lost. Merlin's voice broke through the din. "Arthur, hold her off. I'll need time to close the rift." Arthur didn't hesitate. With a determined shout, he charged toward Morgana, swinging his sword with all the strength he could muster. The blade glowed faintly, infused with the ancient magic of Excalibur, a power meant to protect the kingdom and its rightful king. Morgana's laughter echoed as she deflected his strike with a flick of her hand, her own magic flaring around her like a shield. "You're a fool, Arthur," she sneered. "Do you really think you can stop me?" Arthur didn't answer. His mind was clear, focused only on the task at hand, distracting her, keeping her occupied while Merlin worked. He swung again, this time aiming for her side, but Morgana was quick, dodging the blow effortlessly and countering with a blast of energy that sent him reeling. The impact drove him back several paces, but Arthur gritted his teeth and held his ground. He couldn't afford to fail now. Not when so much was at stake. Camelot, his people, the very fabric of time, it all depended on him. Merlin, meanwhile, was muttering incantations under his breath, his hands moving in intricate patterns as he worked to stabilize the rift. The air around him shimmered with arcane energy, and Arthur could feel the strain it was putting on his old friend. Time was running out. Morgana's eyes flickered toward Merlin, and she frowned, sensing what he was trying to do. "You won't close it in time," she hissed, her voice filled with venom. "I'll see to that." With a sudden burst of speed, she turned away from Arthur and flung a wave of dark magic toward Merlin. Arthur's heart leapt into his throat. If that blast hit Merlin, everything would be over. Without thinking, Arthur leapt in front of the blast, raising Excalibur just in time to deflect the attack. The force of it sent him crashing to the ground, but he had managed to protect Merlina at least for the moment. Merlin's voice rose in intensity, the ancient words of the spell ringing in Arthur's ears as he fought to get back on his feet. The rift was pulsing now, fluctuating wildly as if caught between closing and expanding further. Morgana turned her gaze back to Arthur, fury blazing in her eyes. "You're a fool to resist me," she snarled. "This is my destiny. I will rule, and you will be forgotten." Arthur wiped the blood from his lip and stood, facing her down. "Camelot was never meant to be yours, Morgana. It's not just about me, it's about the people, the kingdom." "You've lost your way." For a moment, something flickered in Morgana's eyes, something almost human. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by cold hatred. "You're wrong," she whispered, her voice like ice. "I've found my true path." With that, she unleashed another barrage of magic, this one more powerful than before. Arthur barely managed to block it, the force of the attack driving him to one knee. His arm shook under the strain, and he knew he couldn't keep this up for much longer. Suddenly, a blinding light erupted from behind him. Merlin had finished the spell. The rift was collapsing, its edges folding in on themselves as the fabric of time began to heal. The ground trembled, and the air was filled with the sound of reality stitching itself back together. "No!" Morgana screamed, her voice filled with desperation. She threw herself toward the rift, as if trying to stop it from closing, but it was too late. Merlin's magic had taken hold, and the rift was sealing itself shut. Arthur struggled to his feet, his heart pounding. "It's over, Morgana," he said, his voice steady. "You've lost." But Morgana's eyes were wild, her desperation turning into something more dangerous. She raised her hands, summoning every last ounce of her power. The air around her crackled with dark energy, and Arthur could feel the temperature drop as her magic gathered in a swirling vortex. "I won't let you win," she snarled. "If I can't have Camelot, then neither will you." With a deafening roar, she unleashed her full power, sending a wave of destruction toward both Arthur and Merlin. The sheer force of it shook the ground, splitting the air with violent energy. Arthur braced himself, but before the blast could reach him, Merlin stepped forward, raising his staff high. A dome of light surrounded them, the protective barrier holding back the dark magic. But Arthur could see the strain in Merlin's face. He couldn't hold it for long. The energy built, the pressure mounting, until with a sudden, terrible sound, the blast imploded on itself, collapsing inward and taking Morgana with it. Her scream echoed through the air as she was consumed by her own power, disappearing into the void. Then, silence. Arthur stood there, breathing hard, his sword still raised as if expecting another attack. But it was over. The rift had closed, and Morgana was gone. The air was still, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the tension in his chest began to ease. Merlin lowered his staff, his shoulders slumping in exhaustion. "It's done," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Arthur let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We did it." Merlin nodded, though there was no joy in his expression. At a great cost. Arthur's gaze drifted to the battlefield around them, the wreckage of a future that would never be. The price of victory was steep, and though they had saved Camelot's future, The scars of what they had seen would remain. He sheathed Excalibur and turned to Merlin. "What happens now?" Merlin's eyes, weary but wise, met his. "We go back," he said, "to our own time, and we make sure this never happens." Arthur nodded, though the weight of what they had seen still pressed heavily on his heart. They had glimpsed a future of ruin and despair, but they had also seen the fragility of time itself. It was a lesson neither of them would soon forget. As they turned to leave the battlefield, the air shimmered around them, and the familiar pull of time began to take hold. The world blurred, the landscape melting away as they were drawn back through the rift, back to their own time. When the world came back into focus, they were standing in Merlin's chamber once more, the rift now sealed. The room exactly as it had been before the whole ordeal began. But everything felt different. The weight of what they had experienced lingered, a heavy reminder of the dangers that lay beyond their grasp. Arthur glanced at Merlin, who was leaning heavily on his staff. "We should destroy any trace of the rift," he said quietly. "It's too dangerous." Merlin nodded, though his eyes were distant. "I will," he promised. "But we must always be vigilant. Time has a way of finding its own path, and not always the one we expect." Arthur placed a hand on Merlin's shoulder, offering a rare moment of camaraderie. "We'll face it together, as we always have." Merlin smiled faintly, though the weight of his own thoughts seemed to pull him back into silence. The future was uncertain, but for now, Camelot was safe. And Arthur knew that as long as he and Merlin stood together, they could face whatever came next.